I think any time you have a powerful country like the Soviet Union in 1945, remember, by May 1945, when Germany surrenders, the Soviet Union is by far the most powerful country in Europe. And it is therefore a threat to dominate all of Europe. It's just the outcome of World War II. And the United States does not tolerate the idea that any other country can dominate its region of the world the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. So unsurprisingly, unlike after World War I, after World War II, we stayed in Europe to contain the Soviet Union because nobody else could do it. And the end result is that you had a Cold War.
And massive displacement and suppression of liberty and waste of assets and all that time period. We still have the Cold War today, don't we?
In a funny way, we do with regard to Russia. I think a lot of American foreign policy elites have been unable to get it out of their heads that the Cold War is over with and that Russia does not equal the Soviet Union. Russia is not a threat to conquer all of Ukraine, much less a big chunk of Eastern Europe, much less all of Europe. We should have good relations with the Russians. Ukraine should be firmly intact. And the fact that we're in this totally disastrous situation today in Ukraine is in large part because of our inability to work with the Russians.
Mearsheimer's key argument here is that U.S. foreign policy remains stuck in the past, particularly when it comes to dealing with Russia. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was supposed to usher in a new era of global relations. Instead, many U.S. policymakers have kept thinking in Cold War terms, failing to recognize that Russia is not the same superpower it once was. Mearsheimer argues that this outdated mentality has led to policies that have directly contributed to the disaster in Ukraine. To understand this, we need to explore the history of U.S.-Russia relations since the Cold War ended and how NATO's expansion has been a source of tension between the two powers. After World War II, the United States stayed in Europe to contain the Soviet Union, marking the start of the Cold War. During this time, U.S. foreign policy was deeply shaped by the idea that the Soviet Union was an existential threat to the Western world. The U.S. built alliances, most notably NATO, to keep the Soviets from expanding their influence over Europe. But the Cold War ended more than 30 years ago. The Soviet Union collapsed, and Russia emerged as a much weaker state with far fewer resources and geopolitical ambitions. Yet, despite this, the U.S. and its allies have continued to treat Russia as if it were still the Soviet Union. NATO, originally created to counter Soviet power, has expanded eastward over the last few decades, bringing in countries that were once part of the Soviet sphere of influence. Russia has viewed this expansion as a direct threat, particularly as NATO moved closer to its borders. Nowhere is this more evident than in Ukraine. Since the early 2000s, Ukraine has been caught in a tug-of-war between Russia and the West. Ukraine's desire to join NATO and align itself with Europe has clashed with Russia's interest in maintaining its influence over its neighbor. In 2014, the conflict escalated when Russia annexed Crimea, and a war broke out in eastern Ukraine between pro-Russian separatists and the Ukrainian government. Mearsheimer argues that NATO's expansion is at the heart of the Ukraine crisis. Russia sees Ukraine as a vital part of its security buffer. When NATO began discussing the possibility of Ukraine joining the alliance, it was seen as a direct threat to Russian national security. For Russia, losing Ukraine to the West was unacceptable, and this drove much of its aggressive behavior in the region. According to Mearsheimer, this situation could have been avoided if the U.S. had treated Russia differently after the Cold War. Rather than expanding NATO and isolating Russia, the U.S. should have sought to integrate Russia into the European security architecture. This would have alleviated Russian fears and possibly prevented the kind of aggressive actions we've seen in Ukraine. Mearsheimer's key point is that U.S. policymakers have failed to recognize Russia's legitimate security concerns. The assumption that Russia wants to conquer large parts of Eastern Europe, like the Soviet Union once did, is fundamentally flawed. Russia's actions in Ukraine, while aggressive, are defensive in nature. They are aimed at protecting its borders from what it sees as an encroaching NATO. Mearsheimer believes that if the U.S. had approached Russia differently, the current conflict could have been avoided. Instead of expanding NATO and antagonizing Russia, the U.S. could have pursued a policy of cooperation. A neutral Ukraine, with strong ties to both the West and Russia, could have served as a bridge between the two powers. This would have maintained Ukraine's independence while addressing Russia's security concerns. But this opportunity was missed. Instead, the U.S. pursued a confrontational policy that backed Russia into a corner, leading to the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing war in Ukraine. The consequences of this confrontational approach have been devastating, particularly for Ukraine. The country has been torn apart by war, with thousands of people killed and millions displaced. Ukraine's economy has been crippled, and much of its infrastructure has been destroyed. And it's not just Ukraine that has suffered. The conflict has led to a dangerous deterioration in U.S.-Russia relations, raising the risk of a larger confrontation between the two nuclear-armed powers. Sanctions, military buildups, and diplomatic hostilities have all contributed to a new era of tensions reminiscent of the Cold War. Mearsheimer's analysis suggests that this could have been avoided if the U.S. had been willing to work with Russia rather than treating it as an adversary. What does the future hold? According to Mearsheimer, the key to resolving the Ukraine crisis and preventing further conflicts lies in recognizing Russia's legitimate security concerns. The U.S. must abandon its Cold War mindset and approach Russia as a great power with regional interests, not as an existential threat to the West. This means reconsidering NATO's expansion and finding a way to integrate Russia into the European security system. It also means respecting Ukraine's independence while acknowledging that it cannot simply align itself with the West without triggering a Russian response. In short, the U.S. needs to adopt a more realistic and pragmatic foreign policy, one that recognizes the limits of American power and the importance of diplomacy in resolving conflicts. John Mearsheimer's analysis of U.S. foreign policy highlights the dangers of clinging to outdated ideas. The Cold War is over, and Russia is not the Soviet Union. Yet, U.S. policymakers continue to act as if Russia is still a global threat, leading to disastrous consequences, particularly in Ukraine. If the U.S. wants to avoid further conflict, it must change course. This means working with Russia, not against it, and finding a way to build a stable, secure, and peaceful Europe that includes Russia rather than excluding it. The situation in Ukraine is a tragedy, but it's not too late to prevent further bloodshed. By recognizing the mistakes of the past and adopting a more cooperative approach, the U.S. can help bring peace to the region and avoid a return to the dark days of the Cold War. According to John Mearsheimer, I think anytime you have a powerful country like the Soviet Union in 1945, remember, by May 1945, when Germany surrenders, the Soviet Union is by far the most powerful country in Europe, and it is therefore a threat to dominate all of Europe. It's just the outcome of World War II. The United States does not tolerate the idea that any other country can dominate its region of the world the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. So, unsurprisingly, unlike after World War II, we stayed in Europe to contain the Soviet Union because nobody else could do it, and the end result is that you had a Cold War. Then, Judge asked him, "We still have the Cold War today, don't we?" John Mearsheimer replied, "In a funny way, we do with regard to Russia. I think a lot of American foreign policy elites have been unable to get it out of their heads that the Cold War is over, and that Russia does not equal the Soviet Union. Russia is not a threat to conquer all of Ukraine, much less a big chunk of Eastern Europe, much less all of Europe. We should have good relations with the Russians. Ukraine should be firmly intact, and the fact that we're in this totally disastrous situation today in Ukraine is in large part because of our inability to work with the Russians." Thanks for watching.